The wind changed just after the man died. It had been still all evening, as if the land itself were holding its breath. But when the stranger's last exhale drifted into the dimming light, something shifted. A dry gust swept down from the north, stirring dust from the barren road and lifting it in slow, sorrowful spirals. Overhead the sky turned the color of dried blood, too red for dusk, too heavy for peace. The rancher knelt in the dirt beside the body, one hand still wrapped around the stranger's cold, calloused fingers. He hadn't let go, not when the man's grip weakened, not when his breath caught, not even when the final rattle slipped from his throat like a thread snapped in the dark. His name, if he ever gave one, had been lost somewhere between the pain and the whispers. The wind tugged at the brim of the rancher's hat. It was an old, battered thing, sweat-stained and sun-bleached, like the man who wore it. Silas Greeley, 51 years, and all of them carved deep into his skin. He looked down at the dead man, no more than 30, if that, and tried not to think of the questions he hadn't asked, the answers he hadn't heard. His other hand gripped the leather pouch the stranger had pressed into his palm only moments before the end. It was stiff with dried blood, still warm in the center. Silas didn't open it, not yet. Behind him, the wind whispered through the grass, bending the brittle stalks until they seemed to bow toward the body. Somewhere to the west, thunder rumbled faintly, low and distant, like the growl of something ancient and waking. The silence broke with a sharp crack, a hoof step, then another. Silas didn't move. He kept his head low, gaze fixed on the slack face below him. The stranger's jaw was clenched in a way that said he'd died, with something unfinished still clinging to his chest. And Silas had a creeping sense that death hadn't quieted him. Not really. It had only passed the burden to someone else. Another hoof step, then voices, muffled, indistinct, but growing louder. Men. Silas finally looked up. At the far edge of the pasture, where the tall grass met the last sliver of sunlight, 6 riders had crested the rise. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Their presence was warning enough. Guns on their hips, silhouettes sharp against the bleeding sky. The one in the middle, tall, lean, coat flapping like a crow's wings in the wind, wore a silver badge on his chest. The sheriff. Silas stood slowly. The leather pouch vanished into his coat. His fingers, still wet from the stranger's blood, flexed at his sides. The lead rider raised a hand. Not a greeting, just a signal. Stay put. Silas didn't move. Not yet. The sheriff and his men rode closer, the sound of hoofbeats now thick and deliberate. Dust trailed behind them like smoke from a slow-burning fire. When they stopped a few yards away, the air between them felt stretched tight as rawhide. "Evenin', Silas," the sheriff said, voice too calm for the scene. "You got yourself a body." Silas looked down at the man he'd just buried in silence. His thumb brushed the crusted blood on his palm. Didn't start that way. The sheriff's gaze dropped to the dead man. His lip curled just slightly. "You know who he is?" Silas shook his head. "That's so?" A pause. "Funny thing. We've been chasing someone fits his description. Said he stole something that didn't belong to him." Silas raised his eyes to meet the sheriff's. "He didn't die from stealing." The sheriff chuckled, but there was no mirth in it, just a flat, tired sound that sat heavy in the dusk. He dismounted, boots crunching on the dry earth. One of his men shifted in the saddle, hand resting easy on the butt of his revolver. "I ain't here for trouble," the sheriff said, but he was already walking toward the body. Just need to confirm a few things for my report." Silas stepped sideways, planting himself between the lawman and the corpse. "He asked me to bury him." "That what he said?" Silas nodded once. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, the mask slipped just a little. Not enough for most men to notice, but Silas wasn't most men. He'd been reading faces and lies since before half these boys had learned to ride. "You giving shelter to fugitives now?" the sheriff asked. Silas didn't answer. Didn't have to. The wind answered for him. Cold now, sharp with the smell of wood smoke and something else, powder. Distant, but rising. The sheriff looked westward and squinted. "That wind," he muttered. "It's wrong." Silas didn't flinch. It changed when he died. The sheriff stared at him, something like unease creeping into his expression. Then the deputy to the right spoke. "You hear that?" Everyone froze. From far off, beyond the hills, came another sound, low and deep, like drums or thunder, but not quite. The sheriff turned in a slow circle, scanning the horizon. "We need to move," he said, more to himself than the others. But Silas wasn't moving. He glanced down once more at the stranger's face, eyes closed, jaw slack, and felt the weight of something passing from that still form into his bones. He had taken the man's hand. Now he had to carry what came with it. "Sheriff," he said quietly. The lawman turned. "I think you're too late." The wind carried the words eastward, toward the riders. Carried the scent of fire, too. Something was coming. The sheriff looked at Silas long and hard. Then with a nod to his men, he mounted up again. "We'll be back," he said. But Silas already knew. Something worse was coming before they returned. He looked at the leather pouch again, hidden in his coat, and the wind changed once more. The first sign was the gate creaking. Silas Greeley didn't hear it so much as feel it, some old instinct rising up from the base of his spine. He'd been up since dawn, fixing the eastern fence, trying to forget how quiet the ranch had become since the harvest ended. The cattle were fat and slow, the sky cloudless, and the wind had carried nothing but dust all morning, until the gate moaned open. He straightened from the post he'd been hammering and turned, squinting through the white heat. His ranch road stretched out straight as a rifle barrel, bordered by brittle scrub and pale rocks. Nothing moved at first. No wagons, no riders, just a haze of dust curling near the horizon, lazy and uneven. Then he saw the shape. A figure, barely upright, moving with the broken rhythm of a drunk or a dying man. No horse, no hat, just a shadow of a man limping through the shimmering heat, like he'd come from hell itself. Silas left the post where it stood, dropped his hammer, and started walking. By the time he reached the gate, the stranger had fallen to one knee. His clothes were torn, stained deep with something dark and drying. One hand clutched his side. The other gripped the top rail like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Easy," Silas said, approaching with caution but not fear. "You're hurt." The man's head turned slowly. His face was lined with dust and dried blood. Sweat streamed from his temple. His lips were cracked. But his eyes, those burned like coals under ash. He tried to speak, but only coughed, a wet rattling sound that left flecks of red on the dirt. Silas caught him before he crumpled completely, an arm around his back, careful not to jostle whatever was bleeding beneath the shirt. The man weighed little, starved, or ridden too hard for too long. Up close, Silas could see the bullet wound, high on the left side, under the ribs. Sloppy, but deep, and fresh. "You got a name?" Silas asked. The stranger opened his mouth. A whisper came out, ragged and broken. "Don't let them find it." Silas frowned. "What?" The man's right hand fumbled at his belt, weak fingers tugging at something beneath his coat. Silas helped, pulling free a small leather pouch, thick and oddly shaped. The stranger forced it into Silas's hand. "Not them. To the right people. Promise." His voice cracked again, and he collapsed fully, his weight sagging like wet cloth. Silas knelt beside him, eyes scanning the road, the horizon, the sky. Nothing moved, but the heat had changed. It wasn't just sun anymore. There was tension in the air, like the seconds before a dogfight. He looked down at the pouch. It was worn but well-crafted, stitched with dark thread and sealed with a simple brass clasp. No markings, no name, but heavy for its size. The rancher stood and scanned the hills again. He didn't see riders, but that didn't mean they weren't coming. Back at the house, he carried the man inside, laid him gently on the spare cot near the fireplace, and gathered what few supplies he kept. Clean rags, boiled water, the small jar of spirits he'd saved for winter coughs. The bullet had gone clean through. That was the good news. The bad news was everything else. Infection had already taken root. Fever made the stranger shiver even in the warm afternoon. "You're lucky I was out by the fence," Silas muttered as he cleaned the wound. "Another hour, and the buzzards would have gotten to you before I did." The stranger didn't answer. His breathing came in shallow gasps. Every so often he stirred, mumbling words Silas couldn't make out. Names, maybe. Numbers. Warnings. Once, just before sunset, the man opened his eyes and locked onto Silas's face. "They'll be looking by nightfall." "Who?" No answer. Only a single, shaking breath. "They want the pouch." The man whispered, "Don't let them find it on me. Bury it if you have to, but not them, not the sheriff." That made Silas pause. "The sheriff?" he echoed. The stranger nodded weakly. Silas sat back on his heels. He hadn't been to town in over a month, but word still traveled the back trails. Sheriff Rudd had cleaned up the Eastern Territories a decade ago and come west like a man building an empire, respected, feared. The kind of man who didn't ask permission, just results. "You cross him?" The man smiled. "Barely. Did worse," he rasped. "I saw." "Saw what?" But the stranger's eyes had already closed again. Outside, the sun slipped lower, dragging the shadows long across the fields. Silas lit a lantern. His hand hovered near the pouch. He hadn't opened it. Something about the weight of it felt wrong, like opening it might make the whole damn thing worse. But now, he needed to know. He placed the pouch on the table and flipped the clasp. Inside, carefully folded, was a stack of paper, not money, documents. He pulled the first one free and unfolded it slowly. Names, dozens of them, with dates, tally marks, land deeds, payment ledgers, notes scrawled in margins about property seizures and silent disappearances, and at the top of the page, underlined twice, "For the eyes of Sheriff Rudd." Only Silas stared. Every name on the list was someone he'd heard of. Ranchers, miners, men who had vanished. Some had moved away, others had accidents. One, he remembered, had shot himself in the head, twice. A sudden gust of wind slapped the side of the house, rattling the shutters. Silas looked up. The horizon had darkened, not from clouds, from dust. 6 riders, maybe more, heading straight for him. He looked back at the man on the cot, still breathing, barely, and then down at the pouch. The wind had shifted. They would be here by sundown, and he had a decision to make. By the time the sun dipped low enough to stain the pasture gold, Silas Greeley had already doused the lamps, locked the barn, and drawn the curtains across every window. The stranger on his cot hadn't stirred since late afternoon. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing was fast but shallow, as if his lungs were already halfway to the grave. Silas stood by the front window, a rifle across his arms, watching the road as the wind began to change. It came in slow at first, like a breath held too long, cooler than it should have been for this time of day. Then it picked up speed, rustling the dry grass and whistling low through the eaves. It carried the scent of dust and something sharper underneath. Smoke. Gunpowder. He set the rifle down and stepped outside onto the porch, the old wood groaning beneath his boots. The sky had gone the color of bruised plums. Long shadows stretched across the valley. From the ridge to the north, a line of dust rose steadily, not wild like a windstorm, but controlled, intentional. Horses. Silas squinted against the dusk and counted 5. No, 6 riders, spaced just far enough apart to flank a man's property without drawing attention. A quiet perimeter. They weren't coming in loud. They were coming in smart. He stepped back inside and shut the door softly, locking it with the old iron bolt. The stranger lay just as he had before, motionless, sweat shining across his brow. Silas crouched beside him, holding the pouch in one hand and the rifle in the other. "They're coming for this," he muttered. The stranger didn't respond, but his lips moved, barely. Silas leaned closer, not the front. The man whispered, "The well, back way, Sheriff." And then his eyes rolled back, and his breath slipped into silence. Not dead, but close. Silas stood again and stared down at the pouch. Those names, those notes. It was no wonder the sheriff wanted it buried. Every page was a nail in someone's coffin, and that someone wore a badge. He slid the pouch back into the false bottom drawer of the kitchen table, beneath the flour tin, and checked the latch. No time to ride for help. No one in town would raise a finger against Rudd or his men. Not openly. Not while the sheriff's iron grip held half the land titles hostage. The knock came at twilight. 3 sharp raps on the front door, followed by the heavy thud of boots. Silas stood still in the middle of the room. The rifle rested on the table beside the lamp, its barrel cool. The knock came again, closer this time, like the sound had moved deeper into the wood. He crossed to the door and opened it 2 inches. Sheriff Rudd stood alone on the porch, his black coat trailing in the breeze. His boots were dusted white, his face ruddy from the ride, but his eyes were steady and hard. "Evenin', Silas," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope I'm not interruptin' supper." Silas didn't return the gesture. "It's late for visitors. Depends what's worth visiting about." Rudd stepped forward, but Silas kept the door braced with his boot. The sheriff stopped just shy of touching him. "He come through here?" Rudd asked, voice casual. Tall fella, dark coat, might be bleeding. Silas didn't blink. "No one's passed my gate." "Funny," the sheriff said, his tone tightening. "We tracked him this way. Dustline says he came off the ridge around noon. Blood trail points right down your road." Then maybe your tracker's wrong." The sheriff leaned in, the edge of his smile twitching. "Mind if I take a look around?" "I do, actually." Rudd's eyes flicked past him, scanning the dim room behind the door. "Lot of folks think refusing a search makes a man look guilty." Silas let the silence do the answering. The wind stirred again, lifting Rudd's coat. After a moment, the sheriff chuckled. "Hell, Silas. Always were the stubborn type." He stepped back, the porch creaking beneath his heel. "I'll respect your property, for now, but don't mistake politeness for blindness. If he's inside, you're harboring a fugitive. That's a crime." Silas didn't move. Rudd turned toward the dusk. "One more thing," he said without looking back. "You still draw from that old stone well out back?" Silas's jaw tightened. "See, funny thing, one of my boys caught sight of some blood near the edge. Said it looked fresh, and when I hear about blood near a well, I start wondering what might be fouling the water out here." Silas stepped out onto the porch. "You bringing something with a warrant, or just vague threats?" Rudd turned and stared at him for a long beat. "No need for paperwork when a man cooperates," he said. Then he smiled again, thin, quiet, and sharp. "You sleep light tonight, rancher. Sometimes that wind turns mean after sundown." With that, he descended the porch steps and walked off into the gathering dark. Silas watched him mount up at the base of the hill. The other riders melted out of the brush like ghosts, joining him. 6 men, all in a loose crescent around the house. They didn't leave. They just sat there, quiet in the gloom, like wolves waiting for the barn door to swing open. Silas turned and closed the door again. He dropped the bar across it with a hollow clunk. The house felt smaller now, quieter. He crossed to the back window and eased open the shutters. Out by the well, something glinted in the moonlight. Boot tracks in the dust. Deep, fresh. The sheriff hadn't lied. Someone had already scouted it, which meant this wasn't a question anymore. It was a countdown. He walked back to the stranger's cot and crouched. "They'll come tonight." The man didn't respond. Silas stood again, and for the first time in years he unlocked the rifle cabinet near the hearth. Inside were 6 rounds, cleaned and ready, and one sawed-off shotgun his father had used during the war. He loaded them both. Then he lit the fire, slowly, carefully, not for warmth, for light, because when the wind turned and shadows moved, it was better to face whatever was coming with your boots on and your eyes open. The knock didn't come again. It came as a boot. The front door shuddered under the force of it. Wood splintered. Hinges shrieked. Silas was already crouched behind the overturned table, shotgun braced. The stranger on the cot behind him, half conscious and fevered. The fire still burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the floorboards. "Silas Greeley." Sheriff Rudd's voice rang through the dark like a bell before a hanging. "Open up now, or I stop knocking." Silas didn't answer. He knew the sheriff didn't come for conversation. He came for cleanup. Outside, boots crunched against gravel, multiple sets. A second voice, thin, high-strung, called out from the side of the cabin. "Back windows shuttered, Sheriff." "Then pry it off," Rudd barked. "I want eyes in that house." Silas took a breath, slow and measured. His hand tightened around the shotgun's grip. He knew every inch of this house, every blind corner, every soft board, every nail he'd driven himself. He hadn't fought in a war, but his grandfather had. And the old man's words returned to him now, like ghost whispers in the smoke. "You don't win by being faster. You win by being quieter. He moved toward the back wall, keeping low. The stranger behind him moaned once, soft and rasping. Silas paused. "Stay with me," he whispered, and the man's fingers twitched in response, barely. Glass shattered from the side of the house. "They're coming through," Silas muttered. "All right." He waited until he heard the first boot thump against the windowsill. Then he fired. The shotgun roared, lighting the room with its muzzle flash. A scream followed, brief, sharp, then silence. Someone hit the ground hard. A second man cursed and scrambled backward. "Shit, he's armed." "Of course he's armed," Rudd snapped. "Fan out. We flush him or burn him." Silas dropped the shotgun and grabbed the rifle. He ducked low, moving toward the front door as more voices rose outside. They'd surround him, but they didn't want a firefight. Not unless they had to. Rudd had an image to protect, even if it was built on silence and corpses. Another knock. More polite this time. "Silas," Rudd called, his voice syrup smooth. "That wasn't necessary. Man's got the right to defend his property. I get that. But let's not drag this out." Silas didn't answer. The sheriff went on. "You and me, hell, we've known each other 15 years. You're a quiet man, a smart one. I respect that. Which is why I'm giving you one last chance. Open the door. Hand over what doesn't belong to you. You do that, and I'll make sure this ends clean." Silas stared at the door. The fire cracked behind him. The rifle felt heavier now, not just from steel and wood, but from choice. He stepped forward and spoke just loud enough to carry through the cracks in the door frame. "Don't think you want what I've got, Sheriff." A pause. "I think I do." Another pause. "Then come take it." For a long moment, the only answer was wind and firelight. Then the door exploded inward. They came in fast, two deputies, both young, both wide-eyed. The first had his revolver up, but not steady. Silas fired once. The man crumpled sideways, screaming. The second ducked low and fired blindly, splinters flying from the table as the round punched through. Silas rolled left, firing again. Missed. Then a voice bellowed, "Hold fire! Hold fire!" Sheriff Rudd stepped into the ruined doorway, gun drawn, coat flapping behind him. His face was carved from stone, but there was something else in his eyes now. Wariness. Calculation. "Damn it, Silas," he said. "You always did pick the hardest road." Silas lowered the rifle a hair, but not enough. "Tell me," he said quietly, "how many men on that list did you bury yourself?" Rudd blinked. "What list?" "You know the one." "I don't." Silas took one step forward. "Then why are you here?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Because you're hiding a criminal. A man with a bullet in his side, and nothing left in his lungs but a name he couldn't say." Silas spat. "That the crime now?" Rudd didn't flinch. "He stole something important, something dangerous, and you know it." Silas nodded slowly. "I read it." That gave the sheriff pause. "You did?" "I saw names. Your name." The room went quiet again. Then Rudd smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you understand what's at stake." "I do," Silas said, "and I aim to stake it." Rudd raised his revolver, slow, steady. "I can't let you leave this house with that pouch, Silas, and I can't let you leave without it." Outside, the wind picked up again. The air turned sharp with smoke. Somewhere in the dark, a horse snorted nervously. The sheriff's finger curled. But before he could fire, a deep voice called out from behind the house, "Marshal, we've got riders coming fast." Rudd turned just slightly. "What?" "East Ridge. 4, maybe 6 riders. Uniforms." Silas froze. So did Rudd. The sheriff stepped back toward the porch, peered out past the split door. Lanterns bobbed on the rise, and then a voice, loud, official, rang out across the valley. "This is Marshal Tolan of the U.S. Justice Department. Lay down your arms. You are surrounded." Rudd's face drained of color. "Marshal," he whispered. Silas stepped to the doorframe, rifle still in hand. Seems the wind brought more than smoke. Outside, hooves thundered. The sheriff's deputies panicked, some dropping weapons, others running for their horses. The stranger groaned behind Silas. It was all over in less than a minute. Dawn came reluctantly. Not the soft, forgiving kind that bathes the world in gold, but a cold, gray seep, like the sky itself hadn't yet decided if today would be worth the trouble. Inside the house, Silas sat by the hearth, boots dusty, rifle across his lap. His knuckles were bloodied from the scuffle. A shallow cut on his cheek stung each time the wind found it through the broken door. Behind him, Marshal Tolan's men were securing the sheriff's deputies out by the barn, tying hands with cord and muttering about federal warrants. But none of it mattered. Not yet. Not while the stranger still lay dying. The cot creaked. A dry cough echoed in the room, rattling and thin. Silas turned. The man's eyes were open, cloudy with pain, but aware now. He looked around as if trying to remember where the world had gone, then saw Silas and managed a faint, grim smile. "You still here?" the stranger rasped. Silas nodded once. "So are you." The man chuckled, then winced. "Couldn't get lucky all the way, I guess." Silas set the rifle down and moved closer. "Marshal's here, sheriff's in irons, but they'll need more than a pouch to hang him. They'll need truth." The man's face twitched. Pain or fear, it was hard to tell. "I read some of what you brought," Silas went on. "Ledger names, land transfers, most of them gone now, buried or run off. But your name ain't there. Neither's the one who gave it to you." The stranger stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he whispered, "Jacob Rance." Silas frowned. "That you?" "No. He's the one who gave me the pouch. Died on the trail, 2 days before I found your fence line." He coughed again. Blood flecked his lips. "He was with the 3rd Survey Corps, Army Mapping Unit, only they weren't mapping. They were cataloging." "For who?" The stranger turned his head slowly to look Silas in the eye. "For men like Sheriff Rudd. Land speculators, judges, railroad buyers, men with money in one hand and fire in the other." Rance stole the records, said it was time someone knew. Silas's jaw clenched. "And what's your part in all this?" "I was a soldier once," the man whispered. "Scouting detail, got out after the Dakota raid, spent the last 5 years ghosting through the territories. Saw enough to make me sick. I met Rance in a canyon near Abilene. He was on the run, told me what he'd taken, what it meant. He'd been shot already, infection setting in. He handed me the pouch and said, 'Get this to a man who'll stand his ground, someone who won't sell truth for peace.'" The man coughed again. His voice was fading. "I didn't know where to take it. I'd heard of you." Silas blinked. "Heard of me? You fixed the white girl's roof after her pa drank himself blind. Paid the town drunk to clean the churchyard when no one else would. Never ran for office. Never raised your voice. But everyone listened when you spoke." Silas looked away. "Never asked for that. That's why it matters." Silence. settled between them. The fire popped once. Outside, boots crunched as Marshal Tolan paced the yard, giving quiet orders. The world beyond these walls was moving fast now. Too fast. The man on the cot closed his eyes. They'll come for it again. Not Rudd. Others. Bigger. Silas nodded. I figured. They'll offer money. Then threats. Then something worse. Silas stood. Walked to the table. Retrieved the pouch from its hiding place. He set it on the man's chest. You said deliver it to the right people. You still think I'm one of them? The stranger opened his eyes. No. Silas's brow furrowed. You were. The man murmured. But now, you're the one. The last one. Silas exhaled through his nose. I'll get it where it needs to go. The man's hand reached up weakly and grasped Silas's wrist. I believe you. And then his grip loosened. The breath left him like smoke from a doused fire. Silas stood there for a long time, hand still under the dead man's palm, as if warmth might pass backward through the skin. Behind him, Marshal Tolan stepped through the doorway. He's gone. The marshal asked gently. Silas nodded once. Tolan looked down at the body, then at the pouch on the man's chest. That the reason he died? Silas picked it up slowly. It's the reason a lot of folks have. Tolan's jaw tightened. You read it? Enough to know it won't stay buried. The marshal studied him for a long moment. You aim to do something with it? Silas turned and stared out the broken door. The wind had died for now, but it would rise again. I aim to see it done right. You'll need protection. I'll need the truth more. Tolan nodded. There's a stage leaving for Santa Fe in 3 days. I can see you on it. Make sure it reaches the circuit court. I'm not putting this in the mail, Silas said. I'll ride. Tolan raised an eyebrow. You trust anyone between here and there? No, Silas said. That's why I'm going. He looked back at the stranger's body. His voice was quieter now. He didn't die just for paper. He died for what happens after. Tolan stepped forward and extended his hand. Silas took it. We'll do our part, the marshal said. But folks like you, that's who this land belongs to. Men who still remember what justice means. Silas nodded. His shoulders were heavy, but his spine had never been straighter. Outside, the sun finally broke through the cloud cover, casting light across the porch, across the corpse, and across the rifle still leaning by the door. The wind hadn't risen again yet, but Silas could feel it coming. Silas left at dawn 2 days later. The grave sat behind the barn, a simple mound of dry earth, marked by a cedar plank with no name. The stranger had died without one, and Silas figured if that man's story ever reached the right ears, it would be name enough. Marshal Tolan had offered an escort. Silas declined. He wasn't marching the pouch like a prisoner under guard. He was riding it like a man riding judgment. He took the long road to Santa Fe, through canyon switchbacks and dry gulches where no law rode except what a man could carry. The wind rose behind him that second morning, steady and dry, and didn't let up. By the third day, it had grown teeth, spitting grit into his eyes and blowing hard enough to turn cattle from water. By late afternoon, he saw the figures ahead. 6 riders, waiting just off the trail near a dry wash. Their horses stood calm, but the men didn't fidget. Too still, too practiced, bounty hunters. Silas slowed his mount. The lead rider stepped forward, a tall man with a smooth beard and a fancy black duster that didn't belong on this side of the desert. His voice was polite, almost cheerful. Afternoon, Mr. Greeley. Mind if we have a word?" Silas said nothing. The rider smiled wider. "We've heard you've come into possession of something delicate. Paperwork, names. Let's say our employers are interested in retrieving it. Quietly." "You know who I am?" Silas asked. "Of course. Rancher, war veteran, bit of a local legend if the stories are true." "Then you know I'm not handing over anything." The smile didn't fade. "I was hoping you'd say that." The man dismounted with fluid ease, brushing dust from his coat like he was stepping into a saloon. "See, I've met men like you, the kind who think a cause is worth dying for." He walked closer, slow and steady. "But the real truth, Mr. Greeley, is that most men die for nothing. Some paper, some grudge, some mistake, and in the end, the dust don't care what's written on your tombstone." Silas eased his hand toward the rifle strapped beside his saddle. The man noticed. "I wouldn't," he said. "My boys have been aiming at you since you crested that ridge." Silas didn't doubt it. He could feel the eyes on him. But he didn't stop. "I gave my word," he said simply, "that you'd deliver that pouch." Silas nodded. "Well then," the man sighed, "guess I'll have to take it off your corpse." He whistled once. The crack of a rifle split the air. Silas dropped from the saddle just before the bullet slammed into the leather strap that had held his rifle. The mare shrieked and bolted, kicking dust into the rising wind. Another shot followed, closer, too close. Silas rolled into the wash, rifle in hand, breath tight in his chest. Another bullet sparked off the rock beside him. The wind howled through the canyon walls, carrying grit and smoke and the angry curses of men unused to missing. He crawled behind a boulder and checked the pouch inside his coat. Still there. Still whole. One of the riders flanked down the ridge, trying to box him in. Silas waited. Let the boots get closer. Then he stepped out and fired. The man cried out and dropped, not dead. Silas hadn't aimed to kill, but enough to send a message. "You think you're the first hired guns I've seen?" Silas shouted over the wind. A pause. Then the man in the duster called back, "You think you can make it out of here alive?" Silas ducked low and moved between the rocks. "I don't have to. Just long enough to bury you with me." More gunfire. Wild. Uncoordinated. They were spooked now. Good. Another rider crept too close. Silas saw the shadow shift behind a juniper and waited until the man's boot crossed the edge of a stone. Then he fired again. This time, the scream was shorter. That made two. The wind kicked harder, swirling dust across the ravine like smoke from a battlefield. Silas reloaded with shaking hands. His mouth was dry, his shoulders tight. He'd spent a life trying to stay out of fights like this. But here he was, covered in dirt, bleeding from a cut near his ribs, trading bullets with ghosts of a world that refused to let men be honest and live. The voice came again, closer. "You die here, Greeley. Nobody remembers your name." Silas shouted back, "I'm not doing this for memory." "What then?" Silas stood up from the rocks, the wind tearing at his coat. "For consequences." He fired the last 2 rounds at once. One at the voice, the other at the flicker of movement down the draw. Both found purchase. A groan followed, and then silence. When the wind finally dropped, Silas stood alone. Dust caked his mouth. His coat was torn. One of the bullets had grazed his side, burned and bloody, but not deep. He limped over the ridge where the riders had waited. The man in the duster was slumped against a stone, breathing ragged. He looked up as Silas approached. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "They'll send others. I know. They'll kill you slow. They might." The man coughed once. "Then why?" Silas knelt. "Because somewhere in Santa Fe, there's a judge who'll read this, and he'll know someone died to bring it. He'll know someone chose to bring it." The man's eyes fluttered closed. Silas stood, wiped the blood from his mouth, and began to gather the reins of the horses the riders had left behind. His own mount was gone, but now he had 6 more, and a trail to finish a trail. As he rode away, the wind shifted again, this time behind him, a steady push toward justice. Silas rode into Santa Fe at dusk, leading 5 horses behind him and wearing 3 bullet grazes that hadn't stopped bleeding since midday. The pouch was pressed tight against his chest, hidden beneath a blood-stained coat. His eyes burned from the wind. His ribs ached with every breath. And still, he rode straight down the main thoroughfare like a man with nothing left to lose. People stopped and stared. A few moved quickly indoors. The courthouse sat at the end of the street like a stone sentinel, its windows glowing with the pale amber of lamplight. Federal flags flapped limp in the rising breeze. A pair of soldiers stood outside, clean uniforms, rifles at their shoulders. They stepped forward as Silas dismounted. One raised a hand. "You're hurt." "I'll live," Silas muttered, brushing past him. "Where's the circuit judge?" "Inside, sir, but court's adjourned for the week." "Not anymore," Silas said, and shoved through the door. Inside, the air was warm and close, thick with ink, sweat, and dust. A lone clerk sat behind a ledger, startled from his paperwork as Silas stormed past. "I need the judge," Silas said. "Sir, you can't just—" Silas dropped the pouch onto the desk. The leather slapped hard against the wood. The clerk opened it, glanced at the first page, then stood up so fast the chair skittered across the floor. I'll fetch him right away." 10 minutes later, Judge Elias Brannock stood in the candlelit chamber, sleeves rolled up, hair gray and thin, eyes like honed glass. He had the pouch in hand, and the documents fanned across the table like a gambler's winning hand. When he spoke, his voice was low and cold. "Where did you get these?" "From a man who bled to death, trying to get them here." Brannock stared at a page, with names typed in military block. Some had red ink beside them. Paid, sold, erased. "You're aware what this implies?" the judge asked. "I'm aware what it proves." Brannock raised his eyes. "And how many men died before you brought this in?" Silas looked down at his shaking hands. "Enough to fill a churchyard." The judge sighed and ran a palm over his face. "I can't take this directly to territorial court. Not yet. We'll need statements, validation, witnesses. You have me." Brannock shook his head. "You're a rancher. You're the delivery, not the defense." "I saw the sheriff put a bullet through a man's spine in his own home." "Did you record it?" "No." "Then it's your word against a dozen others." Silas leaned forward, his voice like gravel. "That sheriff is already in a cell back in Dry Hollow, courtesy of Marshal Tolan." Brannock blinked. "Tolan?" He saw enough to ask questions, and I've got a marshal's letter in my saddlebag confirming the authenticity of this pouch. The judge nodded slowly. "Then we might just have a case." He turned toward the hallway. "Clerk," he barked, "fetch Marshal Greeley. Tell him we need the federal seal. Tonight." The clerk scurried off. Silas sank into a chair and let his eyes fall shut. For the first time in weeks, no one was chasing him. But he wasn't done. 2 days later, the grand chamber of the territorial courthouse filled with press, marshals, 2 federal agents, and 3 men in dark suits from Washington whose shoes were too clean for dust country. The judge read each page aloud, every name, every ledger, every forged signature. He read them like funeral verses, slow and final. Sheriff Rudd's name was on 14 separate documents. A territorial senator was listed on 6. An Army colonel had signed off on 3 known land seizures, including one that resulted in the unexplained disappearance of an entire Navajo family. None of it could be denied now, not with ink on paper and the testimony of a man who'd survived the delivery. Silas stood before the court, hat in hand, and told them about the stranger, about the blood on his porch, about the pouch and the ride, and the men who'd died trying to silence it. When he finished, Judge Brannock spoke quietly. "Do you believe the man who gave you this risked his life for the right reasons?" Silas didn't hesitate. "I believe he thought truth still mattered in this country." The judge nodded once. "Then we'd best prove him right." They issued 32 warrants that day. 3 went to men in uniform, 7 to men in church pews, and 4 were served before the ink had dried. It took less than a week for word to spread. Territory newspapers screamed headlines: "Rancher brings down sheriff in land, grab scandal," and men who had smiled behind money started shaking behind jail bars. Silas stayed in Santa Fe for the hearings. He testified in 3, watched Rudd's lawyer squirm under cross-examination, watched the crowd grow larger every day, some with questions, others with hope. One evening, after the 3rd session, Marshal Greeley found him sitting on the steps of the courthouse, a fresh bandage across his ribs. "You did more than deliver a pouch," the marshal said. Silas stared out at the dusty street. "Didn't do near enough. There's families who'll sleep easier now, and others who'll never sleep again." Greeley sat beside him. "You ever think about staying? Could use a man like you on the federal circuit. Honest, quiet. Folks listen to you." Silas gave a faint smile. "I've got fences that need mending." The marshal nodded. "And a country that needs the same." He rode out before dawn 3 days later. The town still slept. The air was cool. A thin band of pink was rising behind the hills, promising another scorcher. He carried no badge, only a quiet name, a healing wound, and the knowledge that one man's truth, carried on horseback, sealed in blood, had sparked a fire strong enough to bring justice where silence once ruled. He didn't look back, he just rode, and somewhere behind him, justice kept walking. They say the stranger never gave his name because names were easier to forget than actions. They say Silas Greeley was never the same, never raised his voice, never chased praise, never carried that rifle unless he had to. But when someone spoke a lie in Dry Hollow, they watched their words real careful, because they remembered what happened when one rancher decided to stand up, and they remembered that the wind changed the night he did.